Um, Welcome again, everyone. I'm Reverend Dr. Suzanne Winona Duchesne, and I'm visiting professor of preaching and worship at New Brunswick Theological Seminary and an ordained elder in the EPA conference. And today I am joined, you can see them in front of you, spotlighted, three incredibly gifted and generous scholars and activists within our conference. They probably don't need any introduction, but I'm going to brag about them a little bit anyway. Reverend Dr. David W. Brown is a deacon in our conference, also the only living African American inducted into both the Philadelphia Public Relations Association Hall of Fame and the Hall of Fame equivalent of the Philadelphia Advertising Club. He was named a champion of change by the Obama administration for his communications work around empowering nonprofits to make a difference in the communities they serve. He was awarded the Harris Wofford Active Citizenship Award by the Philadelphia Martin Luther King Day of Service Committee for his dedication and longtime support of the King Day of Service, the largest single day of service in the country. He co-founded the Bridge Walk for Peace. Many of you know about this, maybe have even participated. It includes a sunrise walk across the Ben Franklin Bridge. It's the nation's longest such observance, marking the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th. He's a published author, served as the general manager for 900 AM Word, Pennsylvania's only African-American owned talk radio station, and an incredibly gifted leader in our conference. Lydia Munoz is an ordained elder and doctoral candidate at Drew Theological Seminary and is known to many of you because of her exceptional music talent and worship leadership, which she has shared all over the world, as well as the US and locally, and especially with us. She's presently working on her doctoral thesis, which is focused on public theology, and working on a project with Discipleship Ministries to develop a resource for decentering whiteness within worship. So look for that. As she puts it, she has a passion for following the Spirit's lead in creation of sacred moments and spaces for emergent communities, where together as the gathered, we can experience the transformative power of God. And she says her general rule for worship is that the church needs to worship and live incarnationally, which means we live what we sing, and what we sing, we sing what we live, and what we're working to become, God's reign on earth. So you will certainly hear about that today. Dr. Deborah Appler is an ordained elder and PhD and focuses her research on reading biblical texts in ways that promote justice and healthy relationships among humans and the earth. She explores intersections between the Hebrew Bible, gender, and sexuality, and seeks to open conversations on elder abuse, and has worked extensively and collaboratively on a resource that's used in the Moravian Church that reads biblical texts to dismantle violence against women. She's also excavated at many sites in Israel and Palestine, including Megiddo, I'm going to say that wrong, and Jezreel, I should know that. And she's working with one of my colleagues at New Brunswick, Reverend Dr. Terry Smith, on a volume on Ezra and Nehemiah for the Wisdom Commentary series, which promises to be groundbreaking. So keep that book on your wish list. It's coming. We are so glad to have you join us today and to experience a little bit of what we've been sharing together over the past 4 months as we were planning this. So at this point, I'm going to direct you to that chat box down here, down there, and ask you to place in the chat box your expectations or hopes for our time together today. And as you do that, let me lay out the format for this morning. So we're going to look at the text for the next 7 weeks, and we're going to spend about 15 minutes on each text. And Deborah's going to bring in her biblical knowledge. I'm going to bring in some homiletical knowledge. Lydia's going to bring in her worship knowledge. David's going to bring in his ministry, ethical action steps, his knowledge, working in communities. And during the past several weeks, our time together has been spent meditating upon and sharing our views on the texts. So today we're going to expect that the same is probably going to occur. So you'll see we might be crossing over with each other's work as the Spirit moves us. And that's what it looks like. And that's what we're hoping to be able to invite you to do as well, with us and with each other and with your communities. So as we talk, if you have thoughts or questions, I encourage you to type it in the chat box so we can engage them as we go. And hopefully we'll have some time to also verbally chat as well. But before we head into our texts, Lydia is going to share with us how we got to this place and our lens for today.
Yes. So, the term the beloved community has been one that has been used quite a bit, especially because we mostly associate it with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and his call to action, call to reflection, and call to movement for us to become a beloved community. But we wanted to look at that in terms of where we find some synergy and scripture around that. And there's a whole lot of scripture that promotes a beloved community. But what we also realized was that when we use the term beloved community, because we associate it so much with Dr. King and race and that understanding, we often miss all the other things that Dr. King talked about, right? That wasn't just about race relationships, but about community, about the well-being of our neighbor, about the well-being of the world, about shalom, if you will. And so we were thinking about ways that the scripture might call us into that understanding as well. So Pentecost is one of those moments in scripture where it harkens back to a moment where God calls the people of the Hebrew people out of slavery into this reunion at Mount Sinai. And at that reunion in Mount Sinai, God begins to lay out what beloved community might be, especially a community that had been wandering from place to place, right? These are not all people who all kind of knew each other and probably hung out together, but they did share similar pains. They did share similar realities, and their identity was being formed. God was forming their identity. And as they come to Mount Sinai, God begins to shower them or give them these words of how to live. And if you notice, those words are more about living in relationship with each other than it is even about checking off the box whether you do the right thing for God or not, whether you are following God's checklist. But it's rather more about how we love and respect each other, even down to not coveting one another's property, right? Because we want to live in this beloved community. So fast forward to this time of Pentecost, right? Where God almost brings us once again to that moment of the mountain, to the moment where we come back and say, well, not only is this for this particular people called the Hebrew people, but at this moment there are Medes and Persians and all these people listening to you speaking their language. And if you notice, guess what happens? The crowd that's around them, they spark the question, why? What is happening? What is going on? Why are you speaking about the gospel in my language? And it's almost as if the crowd is marking or pacing or initiating the Pentecost experience. And so with that in mind, we thought like the crowd is also asking, what does it mean now that this gospel is being spread in all kinds of languages, in all kinds of cultures, in all realities, in all this? What does it mean then? Does it mean that God is calling us back to the mountain to live in beloved community? And how does the church do that? So these next 6 weeks or next 7 weeks, sorry, is about us looking at how these scripture kind of harken back to what does it mean then to be a Pentecost people, to live in beloved community, and to not only live, but to create it, not just for ourselves as a community that calls themselves Jesus followers, but for the entire world. What does that mean? So that's where kind of like um where we're talking to. Does that help, Suzanne?
Yeah, I mean, we can ask everyone else if that feels good, but a lot of the folks are asking for resources and action steps to take and new ideas. So I think, yes, you've already presented a bunch of new ideas. This is a new way to frame this, right? Hopefully
Oh,
for some of us it may not be, but
right. One more thing I wanted to, and sorry, we are going to do this thing of we interrupt each other because that's how we've worked. So it's very familiar to me because this is the way Puerto Ricans talk across the table. This is what we do. So don't be, no one's cutting anybody off. We just do what we do. So And one of the things is that instead of thinking about, you know how the lectionary says it gives you one day to wear red, right? You know, everybody really wants to wear the red shoes all season long. And my and I want to challenge us to think about Pentecost not just one day, but to think about Pentecost as this season. So instead of us saying the second Sunday after Pentecost, how about if we challenge ourselves to say it's the third Sunday in Pentecost? God is still moving in Pentecost. God is still reshaping and reforming, and the Spirit's still doing this Pentecost thing, right? And so challenge that paradigm that the lectionary, God bless him, the lectionary, kind of set that up. You have to say after. There's no after. We're still in it. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Lydia. Perfect. Because David Tacknorth was just asking about that. He said, "Oh, my favorite, holiday, holy day," but we're gonna have a whole string of them. It's our whole lens. So I think with that, I think we're ready to start off. We're kind of, like I said, going in a certain order, but we may jump over each other. I saw Dr. Foster was like, holy jumping in. I guess it's not your exact words, but I think that's right. We're making a holy space for everyone to share. So Deborah, take it away with, I guess, Pentecost. Yeah.
Well, and I want to thank Lydia for setting that up in such a really powerful way, because that is the text that we're really focusing in on, along with Romans 8 for Pentecost Sunday. And what I'm going to be sharing along the way are some of the things that the four of us talked about throughout this period of time, and some of the things I'm going to forget or maybe skew in a different direction. So popcorning is going to be really helpful. But
you know what? I apologize. I messed up. Everybody, I did not have your emails ahead of time. I wanted to give you something to write notes on. Let me see if I can get it for you real quick. Okay, guys. There is a PowerPoint that I used, and there are handouts built off of that. It's a PDF. I want to see if you can upload it. I apologize, everyone, for not getting that to you. I think this is it. Here we go, and it's got room for notes on it.
And you don't feel bad about going old school. It's always nothing wrong with writing it down.
That's right. That's right. So I made it so that you can actually, you can actually type into the into the PDF, or you can do old school, or you can just get some paper off your printer, like what I do. See this beautiful slides? I'm going to show this to everyone because this is a beautiful slide that I made. All right, so this is where we're coming from. These are all the readings, okay? But we chose some particular ones. And now I'll pop back. I apologize for not doing it. All right. Okay, now we're off.
Okay. So again, I'll be bringing in things that we've talked about. And as Lydia shared, Pentecost, as recounted Acts 2, it's not just about a birthday, because that's what I've done in the past, I know, but it's about basically bringing in a sacred community. It's a beginning of a journey to the beloved community that's empowered. And the Spirit, that's such an important part that we're going to see throughout the entire Pentecost season. In this particular one, there is a connection to Genesis, the same powerful Spirit hovering over the waters and creating out of chaos. And also, some of the things we talked about was who was present in that room, who was there. Lydia mentioned the other nations that were able to hear what was, their languages being spoken by many people. But being a Pentecost people makes us think also, who isn't joining in or who's forgotten? They say that everyone's in the room, but are there some that choose not to be there, or some that are lost in the process? Also, again, like Lydia says, the Pentecost experience emphasizes multiple cultures and languages, people from diaspora or surrounding neighbors. Some of them might have not been the best of friends at times, and they were sometimes deemed outsiders. Yet now, every single one of them testifies to God's deeds and power, sort of a universal declaration. And outside voices are now listened to, and that's really important. They all offer testimony from their own place. They bring in their own culture, their identities as they share the good news. And this is so unusual and amazing. And that's why I think that some skeptics were saying they have to be drunk. So basically, also in this text, I love that it goes to the prophet Joel, and it draws on the promises foretold by him that many are called to prophecy and for the work of helping to bring in again this beloved community, this Pentecost community. The old, the young will see prophecy and visions, men and women, and enslaved peoples. And I want to take a moment here and please pop in if you want to. The NRSV translates doulos, the Greek, as slaves. And a Pentecost people or a beloved community recontextualizes some of this language, that we don't have to use what's in there. We need to think about ethical translations, to think about how that word and how any word might be heard today, and then translate it to represent the intent of what the text is trying to say, really about that everyone's included without dehumanizing other people. So others might want to speak to that too. The community Acts is talking about, I'm almost finished, is intercultural, born of the Spirit. And I want to say a little bit about Romans, just to say that Romans emphasizes the hope and desire to create a new community. When it talks about the whole community and creation has been groaning in labor pains, struggling, waiting, hoping for this new creation to be born. And Paul talks about how we hope for the redemption of our bodies. We might still be uncertain about what this new creation will look like because we've never seen it, but we have deep hope of the birth and we're ready to push this baby out. If the beloved community is calling us perhaps to be midwives to birth this community. So I'm going to pass it on.
Awesome. I love how you were talking about identities in there. I think we did a lot of talk about identities. And so, by the way, just a caveat here to let y'all know, just because I'm going second doesn't mean the sermon is the most important part of the service, okay? Homiletics and preaching is just part of the worship. So I'm going to go over the preaching. Lydia's going to get to the experience of worship, but there are many times, as we discussed together, that the word is preached through the music, through the art, through the liturgy, or the rituals we do on Sunday morning, just as much and perhaps even more than our sermons. So again, I'm going second just because I'm jumping in on the biblical text, but honestly, it's not a hierarchical thing here, please. So to begin with, in general, for all these texts for this time, I think the most powerful way to preach on these texts is going to be to use narrative forms. I think that's going to be very helpful homiletically, not just storytelling, but using narrative methods so that the resulting form that you're going to present it in is going to be narrative. So you're going to hear me share different kinds of narrative methods that you could use as we progress through. But the reason being, storytelling builds trust. And many of you already know this, you know it intuitively, or you just know it. It builds trust, it engages people so they can hear messages they might not otherwise have been able to hear. And I think rhetorically, it's an important consideration for your preaching because building trust is going to be integral to this homiletical work this week and throughout. But in order to tell stories, especially in order to speak stories that proclaim truth and allow us to begin the work of joining together in beloved community, it's going to be important, I believe, that we understand who we are. And I call that know thyself. It's nothing new. I didn't make it up, right? But know thyself. So know your social location. What are your privileges? And alternatively, what are your areas of identity which do not belong to the dominant culture in the US, are not privileged? So for instance, I have privileges which are valued in the dominant normative culture in the US. I'm white. I'm a settler, meaning my ancestors were not born here. Though I have stories about Native American bloodlines in my family, I have no DNA identification or tribal affiliation, and I was raised in white culture. So as far as I know from my research, my ancestry is Irish-French from settlers who arrived in the 1730s. I have a PhD, I'm ordained, I'm middle class, so I have some financial stability. But I'm also a woman. I come from working class roots. My grandparents were sharecroppers in Avondale. My other grandparents lived in Wilkes-Barre in the coal region. And so they worked briefly in the mines and other jobs. I'm a first generation PhD, so I don't come from a long line of educated folks. I had to learn the ropes for myself. I needed to take out student loans to attend school. So yeah, here I am. I'm in debt and in some ways living on the line of financial vulnerability. And all these things make up who I am. They affect how I read the scriptures, how I interpret them, how I preach them, the words I use, the images I use, et cetera, all affected by this. So, and I'm including an article in that Google Drive. I'm going to give you a Google Drive that'll have all kinds of resources, and it will be adding to it so that you'll have access to. And so this is the kind of work that we're inviting you to do for yourself, to look at your own identity and who you are, so that when you come to these texts, you understand what biases you may bring, but also what gifts you may bring that allow you to see things in a different way from other folks. We're going to also invite you to do this in your context, but I'll go over that the next week because I got enough to do for this week. But mainly what I'm saying is that this is going to take some deep work on our part so that we know where we're coming from. And this is lifelong work. And many of you have already started it and you already know. But again, this is a time to begin, if you haven't, that kind of work for yourself. My thoughts about specifically homiletical content here and with Pentecost is that we're talking about testimony in the Acts text, and the working of the Spirit, or the breath of God, in the Romans text, and even the Ezekiel text. The Spirit infuses the bones. So it seems natural we would want to use a method of testimony. And this is, I'll try to remember, I'll get you a bibliography in case you don't have some of these, but Anna Carter Florence talks about testimony, and she talks about how testimony is more than just personal testimony, like an autobiography of our lives, but instead it's a sharing of how we experience the biblical truth in the text and how we live that out and how the text lives in us and breathes in us. And so it's a statement of truth as we see it in a text. And so that means that we're actively engaging with our lives and with the text. And so testimony, as I said, isn't necessarily a self-disclosing, although it might be, but it's more just confessing what you believe and what you see. And so it conveys what you're willing to die for, something that you believe with all your heart about the text and the sermon that you're giving. So this week we're talking about our place in community, and we bring in our particularities, but I would offer, we need to know our particularities and identify who we are so we can identify where we might have been in the crowd, who we might have been. And again, that'll come from working on and identifying our own social location, which is so important to this work. Go ahead, Lydia. Ideas, or someone else chime in.
So here's what I want to challenge us in Pentecost in terms of worship. So normally, a lot of times, and that this is not a general statement, but most of my experience has been that a lot of times at Pentecost, people want to interject a reading in another language or a song in another language, and then and that constitutes our Pentecost experience. And I want to say to you, please don't. Just don't. I want to say, let's challenge ourselves not to take our congregations on cultural tourism events. And what I mean by that is, if the Acts 2 is about a story, is it about testimony from people who are saying, they're asking a question, right? How is it that you are speaking in my language? You're telling the story. What's going on? What's happening? This is a social, almost political in many ways, cultural question. What do you have to say to me is what they're asking. And don't you think people are probably asking the same question today? What do you have to, why are you talking? What is coming? What are the sounds that are coming out of your mouth? Right? That's what people are saying. You know, what are you saying to me? And what do you have to say to my life? Right? And so so if that is their witness, right? And that's the people who gathered there who were shocked into this reality, right? That is their witness. Then the stories behind the hymns and the songs that we sing, they have a witness too. They have a history too. Don't just sing a spiritual. Find out what the story is behind the spiritual, because that's where the witness is. That is where it's not just fun to sing Steal Away to Jesus. Find out why they sang Steal Away to Jesus and where that came from. It's not just fun to sing, you know, y la montaña se moverá. Woo, we get our salsa on. Yay. Find out why in our community, in our Latino community, why that's such a powerful corito. Why? You know what it's saying? It's saying it don't matter how bad they try to build a wall over us. We're going to move that wall in the name of Jesus because the power of the Holy Spirit allows us to. That's where that story comes. That's where that song comes from. It's saying it doesn't matter. We're going to move the mountain. So find the stories, the songs that we sing, the hymns that we use, they have a testimony. Secondly, don't be afraid to use a foreign language. In parentheses, I say that. Don't be afraid to use a holy language other than your own. Okay. But here's the thing. I know that it might be hard to get a congregation to do a whole verse in another language, right? So pick a phrase that can come back again, that it could be a hook, right? That they can come back again to. So for example, in the African, this is a song that I learned in Zimbabwe, but they use it around Africa. It's called Mambo Sawa Sawa. It means things already better. Things already better. When the Lord is on our side, things already better. So maybe your congregation, the only thing they can say is Mambo Sawa Sawa. Hey, you know what? That's good. That's good. That's way better than what they used to say, right? So just, build on that. Don't be afraid of using a little phrase that actually that'll be the hook that'll stay in their minds, probably even more than your sermon, Pastor. Just saying. So that little hook could be the hook that drives the thing. Oh, Mambo Sawa Sawa. When they're standing at the grocery store and they, and things are looking kind of hectic, Mambo Sawa Sawa. When you're standing in the middle of traffic, Mambo Sawa Sawa. It works. It works. So give people little bits and work with that. That's what I'm saying. Tell the story. Tell all the story.
Can I jump in real quick, David? Because there's been the chat box is blowing up a little bit with, are we going to open with prayer? Are we going to do any worship in the beginning? Lydia, what did you tell me? How many times did I stop us about 20 minutes into our conversation when we would get together? And what would you say to me?
So,
haven't we already?
That we've already been praying and doing worship together in many ways. But if people want to stop and do prayer because that makes you feel like you're going to enter into a space, that's fine.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we do. It's about 10:29. This is about the time when I would usually say, "Shall we open in prayer?" And you'd say, "But we've already been praying." So shall I pray for us? And I have a wonderful blessing from Jan Richardson for the end, so hopefully I'll be able to share that too. But let's just take a moment, and you'll probably hear my doggy in the background. Creator, thank you so much. Thank you for this time together. Thank you for your spirit that infuses all of us. We trust that the many weeks that the four of us have spent together are going to bring glory to you as we start to expound upon what we learned from each other. But it's also going to grow more and more and spread out far and wide from this little group now that's gathering in this virtual way, which we know that you are already blessing. So we give thanks and praise and gratitude. Amen. Thank you, David.
Absolutely. And of course, thank you. You never want to pause for prayer or not pause for prayer. So appreciate all of that. So let me try to kind of build around what we've already talked about and really kind of looking at it from the social policy and context, if you will. I think the thing that you all are also probably hearing is that we're trying to move things along. We have about 3 minutes apiece in our sections, which honestly, that's not bad because that's about the length of a song that you're listening to on the radio. So it's attention popping it that way. So the thing to keep in mind is that, look at, the Pentecost as a disruptive moment, right? In terms of kind of like what is the context in which that happened. And I think that's why we always talk about it. It is not, one time after, because that's not how we count in life, y'all. I mean, I think that's the whole thing. Things happen, And guess what? Those things happen on Saturday night and Sunday morning and throughout the week. So certainly when we're talking about addressing our congregation, and I'm going to kind of put my professorial hat here on for a second, because teaching college students is the same kind of deal, in that a lot of the experiences that had just happened this last week about the verdict of the Chauvin trial, for example, I want to talk about chapter 3 in public relations theory. They're not listening because they're focused on this. And I think that in our sanctuaries, we have to recognize that a lot of folks come to those times, whether it's on Zoom or in person or both, as a healing time, as a time to kind of have things interpreted. And our ability, very honestly, to take what's happening in our communities, wherever we find our communities, and kind of make sure we can contemporize that within our messages, can be a very powerful way to do those things. So I think what you're seeing, what you're hearing, is how do we go about doing that? We talked at the beginning about becoming the beloved community, because it is not a static state. It is something that evolves. It's something that continues. It's something that we continue to grow in. You're never quite there, and that's not a bad thing. It's things that congregations are formed as they go forward. It's communities are formed as they go forward. So when we think about the disruption of that day of Pentecost, people talking together that never were able to talk before, people interpreting what was happening in that moment that they weren't able to interpret if they didn't see it. The crowd that we see, and that's the other thing too that I think you hear us saying, is that don't stay restricted to what you see in the text. You bring yourself into the text. And I think that's one thing to keep in mind, particularly as we're looking at some of these contemporary examples. Go back to something that Suzanne mentioned before about how you bring your whole self into it. That's a process. It's a lifelong process. It's, where your comfort level is, knowing your congregation, knowing your community, knowing that, how you even articulate how to kind of plug into some of these things. So there's certainly a range of different things in that one passage in Acts that enable us to kind of dive deeper. But I would also say that it does make a lot of sense, as Lydia just mentioned, is not just to put all that weight on the sermon. The whole service can be a sermon, right? And I think also the one thing we keep in mind, and look at your own environment right now. We're in this time of Zoom, for example, and people are, I'm just going to say it because we're human beings. We look at each other's backgrounds. I mean, literally, like, so you got some crazy cat thing going on. How then do you kind of use those things in terms of bringing your authentic self into the discussion? How do these things affect you? Imagine yourself in that time of Pentecost. What would you have said? How have you been, as an example, in a place where language is happening, and you may be understanding what was happening, but not knowing the language? I love Lydia's example about music, because music tends to be a kind of an equal, you don't even have to know the words in order to get the feeling. So being able to find all these different things that can help us find ways to be able to contemporize these messages, and then keep staying forward as we talk about the things that are happening in those moments. So I don't know about everybody else. I tend to always kind of put my outline together, and I'm going to about to hand it off because we got to get to our next Sunday. I know where I'm about to go in terms of my sermon. I know where I'm about to go. I have all those things, but then I always try to leave room for the spontaneity of the Spirit, because something could happen that morning that if I'm not talking about it, then I'm not really even acknowledging that my congregation is feeling that. And there is an expectation. And it's okay to say, you know what, I don't know how I feel about this. That's okay. Because, these are things that are happening. If we go back to the whole message of Pentecost, I'm sure there were many people in there who even heard what was being said and still like, I'm not sure what just happened here. And that's okay, because we find our understanding and our learning through letting the Holy Spirit help to interpret us, along with our own context in terms of our experience, who we are as individuals, and what message we need to be able to express. I know it feels a little bit uncomfortable at times, but that could be okay too, because in that discomfort, we can find better answers and better bridges if we allow the Holy Spirit to come in. So hand it back off to. I think I'm handing it back to you, Deb.
Yeah, you are.
Back to the top. Okay.
And I'm putting on my timer, so I behave myself. But anyway, this is Trinity Sunday. And this is really pivotal in this whole conversation about working towards beloved community, because the Trinity is not hierarchical. It's interdependency. It's I think Suzanne's going to talk about a dance of the three aspects of creation, sustaining, and redeeming, or however you want to name the Trinity. The language of Trinity isn't explicit in the New Testament, but all of the texts for this week have some aspect of it. And I'm going to focus on Romans and Isaiah. But with Paul in Romans, he reminds us that we are children of God by the Spirit, who connects us as we cry to God, Abba, the Father. In this community, we're joint heirs with Christ as we suffer and are glorified with him. And the same Spirit blows through this upper room. So this is the same Spirit that, like, phew, as David says, kind of disrupts or really makes things change. And the importance of the Spirit can't be underrated, because in 6 verses, Spirit shows up, pneuma shows up 6 times. So that's how important it is. Again, the Trinity is not hierarchical. It's interdependent, harmony, balance, intersectional. And the other thing is the Spirit makes all of us adoptive siblings called to work together and care for one another. So we are called to be in that relationship. I'm going to go to Isaiah 6, because Isaiah's call is such an interesting call. Especially when we think about hierarchies in biblical and modern times. For example, Isaiah is called by God and transformed. He's a priest and a prophet, and he comes from a place of privilege, okay? He is privileged. His vision that he has suggests that he either has access to the temple Holy of Holies, or he has access to someone who does have that. And that is the highest of high that you can get in the priesthood, which means that he's got food, some of the best. He's got security. He's got respect. He's got political access. But Isaiah's called into a new role as prophet, and he's transformed by the Holy Spirit. And I love the method. The seraphim comes in, which is a fiery creature, comes in and puts a coal on his lips, so that he can move in so he can have cleansing words and thoughts. Now, he is before that said, woe is me, I'm lost. I'm a man of unclean lips. I live among people of unclean lips. In other words, what can I do about all this stuff? But I kind of like to think that when the seraphim put the coal on his mouth, it kind of made it difficult for him to talk. And he had to kind of think for a bit, and he had to reflect, because it does say that he had to reflect. And as a result, he changes. He becomes an ally or an accomplice with the poor and suffering, and walks among the people, advocates for justice and righteousness. He takes risks and confronts structures of power. So I think that I love the coal thing. If we think about the coal as really giving him pause to stop talking, to think, and I'm going to stop talking and pass it on.
No, that's good. And, I did it again. There we go. Trinity Sunday. That's our Sunday. I'm going to hand this over to you, David, because you seem to be keeping up with remembering things. David's really, really good. He put it in the chat box for us so that we know what we're talking about here.
Well, I can certainly go on in terms of just following Deb. So when you think about this particular portion, and again, this also gets back to, just as Deb said, about kind of recognizing, we kind of have to, we mythologize the characters in the Bible. Let's be honest, right? We grew up with them. We kind of know where they are. We never really see them as people. I was talking to my wife about, I'm reading now about my grandparents, who I never saw as like people, because I never knew them as people. I mean, but they partied, they danced, they whatever. I won't say all that, but I think when we do that, we find ways to humanize the experience, right? And by humanizing the experience, we can then find ourselves in that narrative, right? So when we think about those things, particularly Isaiah 16, that particular passage, excuse me, in Isaiah, helps us to think about now, kind of look at the whole context, right? As Deb said already, and that this is a person who might be of privilege. What is their perspective as they're writing, or what they're saying as it relates to the scripture that's being said? And then it allows us to be able to check our own context as to, well, how might that look? And I think that if we don't use that as an opportunity, we kind of almost forfeit the opportunity for our congregants, people who might be listening to our message and participating, to also miss that completely. I think perspective is incredibly important. He who writes the history, right, tends to tell the tale, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that when we start to look at that, and start to see, and this is something that my other colleagues on this in the series have kind of talked about. So what voices are not there? What is not being said? Whose voice is not being represented? Where are things that are not being put forth? Because I think then you can build some things within a very familiar text. And I think that that's also, part of what we're talking about. Lydia said at the beginning, like, let's not necessarily be so kind of handcuffed to the lectionary to say this is X after Pentecost. No, here it is. This is the day, right? And we keep moving forward. It's the same way we want to challenge ourselves in looking at the text, because if we recognize that even in our own lives, right, that, regardless of where your ideology might be, or the political leanings, or just kind of like where you might be on things like racial reckoning and so forth, all of us and all of our communities and congregations have been through this pandemic. And guess what? Because we're still in the midst of, but that has been a disruptive moment as well. So when we think about those things, we say, well, how are we now living, and how are we even telling that story? We don't always need to assume that everybody has been vaccinated or even wants to be. We can't always assume that everybody has the same viewpoint of what this disruptive moment is, and how we not only can live through it, but can learn from it. And I think that sometimes we tend to just kind of skip over some of those things because we are so used to, and we know we're all, you have to admit this, we're so used to a certain narrative, certain paradigm, even a certain teaching that makes things a little uncomfortable as to where we're trying to put things forth. I guess the other thing I'll say, and then I'll hand off to my other colleagues, is that I have to recognize that we need to learn while we teach. Right? There's so many things that other people bring to a discussion, particularly around, very familiar texts and familiar seasons like Pentecost, that if we are so kind of heck bent on defending what we know, as opposed to hearing what is being said, we may miss part of the lesson. And I think that sometimes being able to understand, and I really kind of pick a lot of this stuff up from what I call newly minted Christians. They're always, at least for me, they're coming into it not challenging, but questioning. And if we can answer questions and grow, as opposed to having a fixed mindset that says this is the only way, then we're going to miss the opportunity to ourselves have a growth mindset. That can be somewhat uncomfortable with folks. However, in that, every time we can reach this, because guess what, y'all, Pentecost is going to come up again, and we're going to have a different set of circumstances in 2022 and 2023 and 2024. So I think that we always have to have it, not only have it fresh eyes, but really, thank God that we have the ability to readjust, to relearn, to pivot and kind of recognize that there's a context there that, will help us to even strengthen and grow our interpretation of the more familiar texts that we're encountering. I think I hand it back to you, Suzanne.
No, thank you, David. That's perfect, because it goes into mine perfectly. Y'all maybe remember in the group here that I was going to talk about the contextual piece now and how we can get to that. And really, this is based off that Trinitarian understanding of that perichoretic view of the Trinity. It's a horizontal community, of all equal and complete community. It's not a hierarchical, triangular, which sometimes we're more familiar with when we see the Trinity, displayed in imagery. So there's this perichoretic dance, if you will, between the persons, and that can happen with us in our community. Wesley talks about and the great privilege of those that are born of God. The spirit or breath of God is immediately inspired, breathed into the newborn soul, and the same breath which comes from returns to God. And as it is continually received by faith, so it is continually rendered back by love, prayer and praise and thanksgiving. And it's this understanding. We have this great, rich tradition in the Wesleyan faith of this breathing of the Spirit. It fills us, it fills our community, it fills each other. And so here's a chance now to take some methods to help that happen, help that along. All right. So one of the understandings then could come from an understanding of knowing your context. And if any of you are familiar with Lucy Atkinson Rose, she talks about round table preaching. And in her method, she describes how you bring people to the table so you can hear other voices. So maybe in the week beforehand, you have a lectionary group, you have parishioners that are coming for a Bible study, and you sit and you look at the text that you're going to preach on Sunday, and you let them speak to it, to you, so that when you go into the pulpit on Sunday, the congregation's voices come in also. Some of you are familiar with Lenore Tisdale. She talks about the importance of looking at your community and actually analyzing your community. So not just those who come to the table for that Bible study, but your whole church community and even those that are in the surrounding neighborhood. And there's questions that she asks. If you want to look at her book, I'll try and get that for you in a bibliography if you don't already know it. And there's questions you can ask yourself and ask your people to get more in touch with where they're coming from. But then Anju Mary Kim takes it even further, because she talks about preaching in an age of globalization. So she says it's got to be bigger than just our little group of our church, our community, and our neighborhood. It's got to be a global, a world understanding. And so, as David said, what voices are missing and how can you bring those in? You can certainly read about those voices, but she actually offers a model for sitting down with people. And now that we have Zoom, oh my goodness, there are so many ways that you could really open up your mind to other ways of reading a text, because you could start a Zoom lectionary group, and people could be coming from all around the world. One of the things that I also want to bring in here, some of you are familiar with Eric Law's work. We had him come to the conference and talk about this. And he talks about degrees of privilege and understanding who you are. So this is where understanding yourself, your own social location, and helping others, like your parishioners, to understand their social location can be very helpful. Because some of us, you can hear me chatty, chat. All right, a white woman, I'm used to talking. I'm also a very extroverted person. I will talk over people. There are times when I just need to and let other people speak that haven't had a chance to. And as pastor, there's privilege there. Closing my mouth and listening for others. There's so many levels to this of letting others speak. So if we realize that maybe we're speaking a lot or we're coming from a privileged position, maybe just keeping quiet. Doesn't mean we never speak. It doesn't mean we never contribute. It just means that maybe we let someone else talk first that hasn't yet. So these are all different practical ways in which we can do that. And I wouldn't suggest, as Deborah pointed out with Isaiah, that we need to burn our tongues, but sometimes just closing them, just closing our mouths and pausing for a moment and having an opportunity for other to speak. And David, you spoke to an unholy trinity, but I think Lydia needs to get in there. But I would love for you to talk about that in a moment, because I had an idea homiletically for that too.
Absolutely. And it could be a nice setup, because if you do any research, particularly as King and those folks who've worked on civil rights have looked at the what they call the triple evils of beloved community. They focus on racism, materialism, and militarism. So looking at those three areas, we know even today, those are all three tough things, right? You know, being able to tackle or talk about anti-racist behavior if we're ever going to be in a beloved community. But talk about, and Lydia spoke about this, not coveting things, so we can kind of push off around materialism, kind of recognizing that even being on Zoom, folks, is a little bit of a materialistic privilege, because that means we've got access to a computer, access to the internet, access to our intellect, access for a gathering. So materialism is important. And third, certainly, as we look at this series, the Spirit of Pentecost happens to also go across Memorial Day. And we know we have a lot of folks within our congregations that are, proud military, and God bless them for their service, but also to recognize that, there are ways, and particularly in a beloved community, that peace is not necessarily the absence of war or violence, but it is an active way to work toward a better outcome, if you will, where people don't have to lose their lives, or where people are objectified to justify violence. So thinking about those, and we've been calling it the unholy trinity, but those three about racism, materialism, and militarism are the three that are typically associated with the beloved community. And with that, let me pass it over to Lydia. Muted, my dear.
Just really quick emphasis on this particular Sunday is the notion around what is identity and what does it mean to be family. So for many people walking in our congregations, family could be a good thing, but for a lot, family is where a lot of pain comes from. So let's be aware, we tend to, in our communities, we tend to overemphasize people who are in relationship, in a partnered relationship, have family, and we really kind of like highlight that. And that's and I get it, but the other part of it is there's a lot of people that feel completely disconnected from their family of origin, either because they have been disconnected by them or by their own choice for self-preservation. So it's really important that that as we emphasize family, as we emphasize interconnectedness, the beloved community, what God is defining, right? So what's happening with Peter and those people, and what's happening with Isaiah, is that Isaiah is being transformed, so that no longer does he see people as those he serves, but those he is connected to. They become his family. The people become his family. And so it is about reshaping that word family, giving it a Pentecost twist of that word family. So the other thing is, there's a lot more that you could say with the symbols in your worship space than you could ever say verbally. So what does your worship space look like now that conveys to people that there is a sense of family, and that people can be connected? So in other words, what colors do you use? What is accessible to people? In other words, as they sit around or stand around or be in the building, what is accessible? We all have those spaces where we say that is the holiest of holies. We don't say that, but we kind of do. But don't go there, right? Is it a space where children feel that they are seen and not heard? That's really important, really important. One of my favorite things to do is to invite children to come up to the communion table and help me do the whole consecration prayer. It completely turns the heads of people who say, you have to have an understanding of how you come to communion. Actually, no. Do you know, does God love you? God wants to take care of you. Okay, that's good. That's good. That's it. That's communion, right? God loves me. Yay. And gives me bread. Hooray. So, this is, make it accessible. Show what family is. The distance between you and the congregation. A lot of us really need to look at that and what that means. Maybe we need to tear down some of the decentered or the centered hierarchical look in our worship experiences, and begin to start to live within the worshiping community, because after all, who calls who? Don't we, in the end, don't we call each other? Don't we identify the call of God from each other, right? Don't we say that in our which community identifies the gifts and graces in you to become a candidate for ordained ministry? The community you hanging out with, the people that you're with. They're supposed to identify. So guess what? I think they continue to call you. They do. They continue to call you, and we continue to call them. So, that reciprocal relationship is really important. Last thing, worship teams, performance versus participation. I actually think it's both. I think there is elements of performance. You rehearse, you get together, you practice because you want to do your best. But if your team is gathering for the congregation to sit back and watch them sing, then there's a problem there. That doesn't convey community. That conveys, I'm gonna go in there and with my coffee, with my latte, and watch them sing. And then the sermon's gonna happen in like 30 minutes, right? So, you use a lot of different ways to convey that there is actually a community here, a interrelated, exquisitely mutually interrelated, that we depend and rely on each other. So that's what I have to say about that.
On to the next then. If that's the case, we're going to look at the next Sunday in Pentecost season. And building on something that you said, Lydia, the issue around hierarchy and not having the hierarchy. This Sunday, we're actually looking at texts that deal with hierarchy and how we help build them and how that helps to divide the kingdom and divide the house. For example, and Mark talks about a kingdom that basically that a house divided can't stand, that a kingdom divided against itself also can't stand. And Suzanne's going to talk more about Mark, but I'm going to say something about Samuel, because you have basically the people are not the whole, that's the question. Who asked for this? Because the text is pretty clear. It's the elders of the community who asked for a king. And the question becomes, who else wants this king? Are the people who are most vulnerable, the people who have less, the people who are going to be oppressed by this system? Are they going to do they want this? So basically, you have Samuel listening to the people, going back to God. God is not happy about the situation, but basically allows them over time to just go ahead and let them have it. But Samuel warns, and this is one of the most important texts in the Hebrew Bible for understanding injustice. And it actually plays out later on in stories like Jezebel, where in Naboth's vineyard, where we see the same kind of abuse of power. But basically, the people demand a king so they can look like the other nations. They wanted status, or not the people, the elders. It's funny because the text goes back and forth on that. Is it the people? Is it the elders? We're not really always clear. And basically what he says, and this is true, that if you build this house, if you have this king, then it's going to be a problem. And if we look at Solomon, he's a great example because he had to feed thousands of people from his court. And in order for people to do that, they had to be forced. They ran out of money. If there's a bad season in agriculture, they don't have the food. They have to sell land. So they go into debt. They have to sell their children. There's land confiscation, trafficking of children and other people to pay off the debt, poverty. It snowballs. And those who benefit from the system figure out a way to keep the system working, even when it's clear that many people suffer. So basically, this text gives us an insight into what happens when we want to look like the others and have that kind of status as a community. Who struggles from that? Who's left out? Who's hurt? How do the political systems oppress? And I also want to ask the question, why does God let it happen? Because Samuel leads him in, but the text is clear that Samuel does it because God says, go ahead and give them what they want. Although we know the rest of the story with the exile, but that's for another day. So I'm going to stop here and hand it over to whoever, Suzanne or whoever's going to go next.
I'll just quick offer some ideas for this. Again, bringing in narrative theory. I was thinking of, some of you might be familiar with Eugene Lowry, and a Lowry plotline could be very interesting. He uses a plot form or a narrative form that you would find in literature or even jazz music to present the problems in the text today and then to kind of flip the text so that we can learn how to live differently than we did before. So for instance, and I'm not suggesting that you do this for your sermon. I mean, take it if you want to, use as much as you want, but I think that you probably have, if you haven't realized it already from what we're saying, we all have very important views on these texts. So my views are no more than yours. So bring yourself to it. But here's a thought, the first complication could be dealing with the ways in which sometimes we disagree with each other. And I'm thinking about the Mark text in particular, how we disagree with each other, and how if someone doesn't agree with us or see the world the way we do, well, they can't possibly be of God. And we want to demonize them. If they have different experiences than ours, we say, how can they possibly be a Christian and think that way? And then in this text particular, just to make matters worse, we could look at Jesus and his experience as a further complication, because in the text, the crowd actually turns against Jesus. And we want to make it about him, but really, I wonder if it's because he's challenging the power structures. So there's something we need to be thinking about, right? And what does he argue? He argues that they don't know what they're talking about, because he couldn't possibly come from demonic forces with all the good things he's doing. But then it gets worse, because the text actually says that his family starts to attack him, and they want to take him away because they think he's crazy. And Jesus actually turns on them, the very ones that could possibly offer him solace and protect him. He turns on them and attacks his own mother and his own brothers. And he says, hey, you guys are my family. Who's my family? They're not my family. But I would offer there's a flip here. And in most texts, there's going to be a flip somewhere. And if we consider the fact that that word family actually can mean associates. So it may not have been his mom and his brothers that were turning on him. It may have been those around him that are like, oh, this guy's crazy, what he's saying. And so if we look back at the history of his mother and his brothers, they were very spirit-led people. And so it may not be that he is condemning his biological family at all. It may be that he's actually affirming all of us as his adopted human family. And so again, understanding our place within the community, our ability to humanize all people. People are trying to dehumanize Jesus here, trying to really, like I said, make him look like, the Satan has got him or something, right? He's being possessed. And he's really saying to them, look at me, see me. I am a human being. And I think he's inviting everyone there to see each other. We are all human beings. He's trying to humanize everyone through this. So I had some other thoughts, because it is, so this is the way that you could use narrative, right? Some things you might want to keep in mind, though, is that this week is, one of the things that we didn't talk about was, I think Memorial Day was the week before, wasn't it, guys? And we've got a lot of military stuff within these weeks and that's also very interesting, because what was that unholy trinity that we heard about, right? The militarism piece. But we've also got veterans, we've got Boy Scouts, we've got people who really, honor this military institution. So I want you to consider this is the D-Day memorial, and it's 77 years since that happened. So questions that you might want to ask, what does it look like to unite against a system of evil? What led to that day on the beaches in France? Oh, we got somebody who's unmuted. What is it that led to all that, right? If we look at World War I and the way people treated, if we look at the 19th century and what happened with the Franco-Prussian War, if we look at our own history, okay, what we did, what we called the plan for dealing with the Indian problem became the Nazis' plan for dealing with the Jewish problem. None of us get away. None of us can escape. And so how does this unholy trinity show up? And we can bring that theme back into this next week. You can easily refer back to, remember last week we were talking about? Well, guess what, folks? And this is what Beloved Community is working against, to dismantle, right? So there's lots of things that you could do, but I will turn it over to Lydia so that she can share some worship ideas with us.
I keep doing this all the time. This is one of those Sundays where I think this is about a lot of self-reflection on leadership. Because I really believe that both Samuel and Jesus were making a choice to speak up about the possible complications of both the choices of the people and Jesus's decision to be move forward in the call that Jesus was feeling, even if it meant his own family was going to go against him. And what does that mean? And one of the narratives that I think, or one of the stories that would be helpful in the midst of all this, as Suzanne was talking about the militarism, how we sometimes tend to glorify that military reality of our country, is to look at people like Fosdick, who wrote God of Grace and God of Glory. The hymn and the man behind this this hymn of the church that is really important. Think about that. He wrote it in the midst of the middle of the Great Depression, and also moving into the war, right? And this man was a committed person to the gospel of Jesus Christ, so committed that his moments of prayer for the community were often seen as rebellious and against, because he really would oftentimes lead people to pray in the square against the war, against violence, against all these things, and it was rather unpopular at that moment, just like Dr. King was rather unpopular for most people. We know him now because we have the day and the whole thing, but he was not popular. He was not popular. He was making statements that were really unpopular to most preachers and denominations. And so I think it's really important to bring into that worship experience, what does it mean to be, now that we are called, right? The Isaiah story, what does it mean to then really answer that call in that way? What does it mean to step into that, even when it's not popular? What does it mean to challenge, and to say, and to take on the task of challenging that within our worship experience, and to allow people to say it, to invite people to think this is your call too, through our music, through our prayers, through this is a challenging time in the life of the church. And for too long, we have allowed Christian nationalism to take over the narrative of the gospel. And to challenge that is going to put you at risk. And so the question to me is, do you want a king or not?
This might be a good place for me to jump in, particularly as we ask ourselves the question: are we trying to be popular from our pulpits, or are we trying to be powerful from our pulpits? Honestly, and this is where this journey with Lydia, Deb, and Suzanne has helped me, in that we have organically formed a kind of like a posse, if you will, because we don't all have the answers individually. And I think that sometimes, and as Lydia had mentioned, I think that sometimes we're coming up on something that we may feel passionately about, but we're thinking about our appointments. We're thinking about, can we stay here? We're thinking about, what kind of ruckus might we kick up if we, feel how we need to preach a particular message. And I think that, going back to the scriptural text about, do you want a king or not? There's implications with all of that. And I think that part of what we want to be able to share with you all is that even on this particular Zoom, there are folks that are on the Zoom that could be great preaching partners for all of us. And we're not trying to even give anybody preach like me, no, preach like you. But there are words that for some of us who have been able to find both the resources that we've been talking about, as well as kind of like, well, there are some words that can help to articulate some of these things. But even more importantly, I think that it's even more valuable to be able to kind of plug in with other people to say, look, I'm thinking about preaching this message on this. It's probably not safe to do that within the congregation, but within our clergy, we should look to try to plug into things. We need to be able to find ways to speak in such a way that is authentic to ourselves, but also recognizing that even our own theology and ideology, they're still evolving. Thank God that they are, that we're still learning as we go. And I think that becomes a very important part of how we as a community can connect with other folks. There's some of us who, since we've kind of talked about the societal context here, are kind of more on the street than not, and that's one is not more important than the other. It simply provides a different perspective that can help even inform our own message development, our own delivery, and I think that we need to think, so what has worked for each other, and more importantly, what hasn't worked, because I think that could also help us to determine, because if we get so focused on whether we're preaching for power or we're preaching for popularity, that we miss the ability to deliver a message that's articulate, that's authentic, that is real, that is relevant, then we're not necessarily doing our congregations or the communities that we serve any favors. So I think that part of what we have to continuously think about is how then do we do those things. And I see in the chat, which is very important, about things like trust and safety and courage. And this is not meant to demean anybody, but those are very real things that are built over time, not overnight. And we know that we have to make sure that we are continuously in an environment where the folks who we are blessed to lead can trust us. And we also have to, very honestly, and I'm going to go back to the notion that Lydia mentioned before about the messages that someone like a Dr. King put forth at the time were not popular at all. We now have, and we talked about this at the beginning when we got together, how we mythologize folks in the scripture. Well, we mythologize folks within our own contemporary lives. We look at them in a very binary, myopic way because that's comfortable and it's been commoditized. And I'm a real big student and teacher of advertising and public relations, so I understand that as a notion. But when we start to really do some work and start to peel away some of the complexities of things, these were flawed people, and we have to recognize in those flaws we find ourselves. And if we can find ourselves in those flaws, then we can be able to deliver messages that are not only authentic to who we are, but also allow our congregations to better identify with them, so they're not put up on a pedestal. We're talking about, and this message can be very powerful, particularly during election time and things of that nature. We're talking about June 6th, which is the anniversary of D-Day, and kind of recognize how we as a culture and as a nation have kind of moved of certain things, and again, mythologize different experiences. But I think we also have to be very, very real, as well as being appreciative of what sacrifices have been made for us to be able to even consider preaching from a pulpit that could be popular or powerful, because we live in a country that enables that freedom of religion and expression to happen. So I say all that to say that there are resources among the little Hollywood squares and mosaic that you see that are very, very important for us to plug into. And also there are tons of resources, and I know Suzanne's got a good chat going in terms of putting things up, and Lydia just put some stuff up in terms of history of hymns and things of that nature. We want to urge folks to recognize that there are other things that can help inform the messages that we're trying to bring, and also at the same time enrich and educate us as we try to deliver them. So let me hand it back. I think we're going to Deb next. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I was going to jump in real quick here and say, y'all know what this is, yeah?
Yeah.
Pomegranate. So I have a, Wegmans has them right now, but there's a liturgy that I will drop in the Dropbox that you can play with and turn it into your own. But when you rip open one of these things, it stains your hands, right? And if you wipe it on a paper towel, it almost looks like blood. And there's some of you are still online and maybe you're doing love feasts. Maybe to invite people to have a pomegranate and to open it up and to feed each other, or to even feed themselves, and let that. So there's a liturgy that goes along with the idea of there's blood on our hands. We all have blood on our hands about something, and what are the ways in which we actually, instead of dismantling death-dealing systems, we actually reinforce them, and maybe having repentance around that. And so there are some liturgies that we could do if you wanted to, and you don't have to do it on this particular Sunday. You could do it on other, but this one seemed to really stand out for me. But and on your clothes, Mandy, you're talking about with the pomegranate. Um, quick check-in in the chat. If you've got questions, if you've got ideas, we're moving along. We're a little bit behind, so we want to keep moving. But if you have questions, please put them in there and we'll try and get to them. A lot of you had some really good questions about how our sanctuaries reflect what we're doing. So thank you, Lydia, for touching on that, because it's just a sign to me how the Spirit's moving. So Deb, I have got that PowerPoint again, but guess what? I saw Lydia's smile come up. I saw her smile come up because look what I did. All right. All right. It's in or right. Yeah. Okay. All right. So it's not after Pentecost. And we're going to go into Samuel.
Okay. One of the things that Mark and Samuel for this week call us to pay attention to is who is overlooked and missing in the narrative. For example, when Saul's sent on a mission by God to anoint a new king out of the sons of Jesse, who God will pick, Jesse ensures that all of his first 7 sons are sanctified and brought to Saul to be chosen. Yet none of them are chosen. None of them measured up. And then Saul asked, but don't you have someone else? And Jesse said, oh yeah, I have another one. Jesse didn't even think that David was important enough to be examined. And those of you who are like me from a really large family probably get what it's like to be lost in your family system among your brothers and sisters. Yet God specifically chooses number 8, the least powerful. It turns out that that David is exactly what God is looking for. He has a good heart. And he's initially overlooked by his own father. Why is he ignored? Because he's young? Is he number 8 and won't inherit? Does the power structure devalue him? Who makes the choices of who matters? That's a question I think we need to think about when we look at this text. Who chooses? Without God's intervention, David, who has a good heart and a person after God's own heart, would have been excluded. And I think we need to think about how many people with good hearts do we exclude, or do I exclude, because we don't really see them. Mark shares the parable of the mustard seed, a teeny tiny seed that we barely see and not a main crop. The seed is so tiny, but it grows up into a large bush that provides respite for birds of the air, who, by the way, we usually don't see either. God cares for all of God's creation, from the great behemoth to the armadillo and the ant. Just a little bit of faith are as welcome as those whose faith is the size of an ocean. So Pentecost people take note of those who are not present or who are not easily seen, and they recognize their importance in community. We're interdependent. Samuel needed to see everyone in order to find God's choice. The seed needs the soil in order to grow, and the birds and trees work together to grow. One of the things we talked about as a group, and I'll do this very quickly, is that Lydia reminds us of the term ruddy that's used for David's appearance. And it's often been used to paint a picture of what David looks like. But there's often implicit bias in the portrayal. He's not necessarily short or white for sure, or red-haired Anglo-Saxon. And the ruddy could be connected to Adamah, or the ground that humans are made from. So David's human, imperfect, but chosen by God to lead. And then another aspect you might want to consider in this story is that even though Saul's trying to kill him, Samuel is grieving majorly for Saul's inevitable departure. And he's not in any hurry to move on. And God calls him out on this and tells him he's got to move on. And sometimes it's not easy, even for those most centered in God, like Samuel. And we want to cling on to unhealthy leaders and unhealthy systems because sometimes we benefit from them, from our privilege. And so this gives us an opportunity to have a conversation about what do we hold on to that's not healthy. I'm passing it on.
No, that's wonderful. And really, so taking the ideas that Deb just presented and imagining yourself as one of those characters. Here's a thought of a narrative form that might work this week, doing a first person, if you've ever done a first person interpretation of a text. And so again, what would it mean to inhabit David? What would it mean to inhabit Samuel? What would it mean? What if you were one of David's maiden aunts who's watching, or his mother, or someone who you just imagine someone there watching this. What if you were Jesse and you realize, what have I done? I left my son out, but then again, just some logistical things and practical things about when you're going to do this. If you have never done a first person before, are you going to wear clothing of the period, or are you going to update it? Are you in the pulpit or are you online? So how are you going to indicate that you're moving in and out of character? So just think about that and how you want to do it. And what kind of emotions and feelings you want to bring to it. But then also, how are you going to bring the congregation into it? How are you going to have them see this as more than just you're retelling a story, but it's actually coming to life? So perhaps you're David. We know David got into some trouble later on, right? Looking back on his life to those good old days when he was really listening to God and he was anointed and called. You could be a person looking back on those good old days. All right. You could be Michael, right? Deborah, we talk about his wife looking back and maybe she heard stories about him when he was a kid and you could be relating. Yeah, well, that's not the David I knew. I mean, you could talk about things like that and you could bring it to life for people. And then that idea that there are death dealing systems that maybe we're unwilling to let go of. And maybe that comes into how it's relevant for you today. But, listening to the Spirit and how it leads you to find some relevancy between this story from this person so long ago, bringing them to life. And then what does this mean to us? How does this Spirit live in us, whether it be, a spirit of God or a spirit of something else that's, death dealing.
So I would like to invite you to look at the General Board of Global Ministries had put out several song books called Global Praise 1, 2, 3, right? That have a variety of music. And in number 3, the one that is called For Everyone Born, there is a song in there it's in English and in Spanish. If you only had faith, just like a little seed of mustard. Here's what I'm going to invite you to do. This is an opportunity for people who may that have questions more than they have answers. So notice what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying your faith does not have to be big, right? You don't have to have it all together. So we forget that so much, we really do. And I think people often hear the message from a lot of their religious experience is that you have to have it all together. How many of you have heard, I just don't have it all together to come to church, right? I mean, that is, I've heard that over and over again in my ministry. And I always have to remind them, I'm so glad because you're joining the right crew, because we put the fun in the dysfunction. So just come along. So giving people permission to say, I don't know if I believe that whole story, Pastor. I don't know if I get all that, or I don't know, but I believe a little bit. You know what Jesus is saying? If you only had faith just like that little bit, you can tell the mountain to move. You can build a beloved community with that little bit of faith. So let's encourage people to enter into our worship experiences, not knowing all the answers. Creeds are important in historical sense for the life of the church, but sometimes maybe people won't respond to a creed. They'll respond more to a song that invites them to take a journey with God, to take a journey with faith and with each other, to try to figure it out, to try to enter into this moment. So think about that. I love this song because there is movement. There is, there's joy in it. And there's also joy in the fact that you don't have to have it all together. You only have a little bit of faith. And you could tell that mountain, y la montaña se moverá. And you could tell the mountain, move away, move away, move it just a little bit, just a little bit. That's all you need to come in here. That's all.
And if I can jump in, David obviously is one of my favorite characters, named after, so just putting it out there. But I think that there's a couple of things that I want to point out that kind of might enable us to kind of connect all this together. One of the things that has so always struck with me, and if you've ever met me physically, those of you who have met me physically know that I am not tall of stature. So I'm used to being overlooked. I'm also the middle child, used to being overlooked. I'm 5'5" on a good day. And my friend Andrew Foster might even dispute that, but I'm just going to say I'll claim the 5'5" status. But here's the thing to keep in mind, particularly with this time and when this particular scriptural reference is preached. It's also right around the time where a lot of us are starting to look at who's going to be in leadership for next year. It's a time around nominations, things that are starting to happen. And one of the things that always struck me about this particular passage is just as we said before, so who was not there? And this also enables us to start kind of questioning a little bit about how do we ascribe value to people, right? So when you think about this, this particular passage in Samuel, and I've been there, I've been where David is, where it's like, okay, no, this is all Bible. If it weren't for the intervention of God to say, well, there's somebody missing, I think. And then there was also an intervention of God with David's father saying, oh yes, David. But it was also an intervention with David who said, yeah, I'm ready. So it wasn't like he wasn't ready to do whatever he was being called to do. And who knew that he would be called to slay the giant and everything else? I mean, so you think about those things even in our own congregations, because we tend, and I'm going to build on what Lydia said about, folks, when we ain't ready yet to be church. We're not ready yet to be a leader. We're not ready. Well, guess what? If churches were only made up of people who are ready, we probably never have church. I mean, we're not trying to work with people who are whole. We're trying to work with people who are broken. And if you're broken, then we can find ways together to heal, right? And let's be even more clear. None of us, sometimes we're preaching from the pulpit thinking that we're perfect. Really? Not at all. So recognizing in our brokenness, we can find healing together is very, very important. And another thing that I'll say is look at that notion about the mustard seed. Unless you've ever planted a mustard seed, you don't know how big it's going to grow. I mean, I don't know about you. I like to cook and I like mustard and I've cooked with mustard, but a mustard seed, I've lost plenty. But there's also a role of collaboration that has to happen. You can't just plant the seed and walk away. You got to water it, you got to tend it, you got to make sure it's in fertile soil and so forth. Same deal with this notion of David. When David was identified and they looked at him, the first thing, Saul was saying, like, let me show you how to use my armor. Let me show you how to do this. It was some training going on that David was like, I appreciate it, all due respect. It's too heavy, can't do this. I got another kind of new technology I'm going to use. It's called a slingshot with a couple smooth stones. And being able to say like, yeah, okay, give it a shot. What do we got to lose? We're not winning. What do we have to lose? So I think sometimes when we think about how we ascribe value, whether it's the value that we have in our congregation, the value we have on people who may be leaders, I'm just on my own self-reflection. June 13th, which is the Sunday that we're talking about, is like right the halfway point to June 30th. And that's when everything is starting to happen. People are going away. So I'm hoping that even in my own congregation, we're going to be doing who's re-upping for the year? And I need to make sure that I can kind of step back and not ascribe value or even kind of recognize that the leaders that you might have who are currently the seats may not be the leaders that you need going forward. When they called on David, it was because they didn't have a solution. They needed something different. They needed and had to have some trust in God to be able to allow them to have this Holy Spirit to step in, to be able to make that mustard seed grow to the bush that it would be, to make David to grow into the king that he would be. We've got to find ways to use that in a setting that enables this particular passage to check ourselves while also giving grace to what the Holy Spirit can do with the congregations we're privileged to be able to lead. So let me hand it back. I'm watching our time. We're around, and this is the professor in me. We're right about the third, at 30 minutes. So I want to make sure everybody's, energy is high. We're going to kind of bring this thing home. So I'll hand it back to you, Suzanne.
Let me see again. Wait a minute. Did I have us in the right place? Did I take us to the wrong place? Tell me where we are. Where are we?
I think we're going to start with the week for June 20th. We all went through. So
is this where we are?
Yeah,
we're 17.
We're on the fourth Sunday in Pentecost.
Okay, excellent.
Okay, all right. And David,
this is what happens when the Spirit takes over. We just lose all track of time. Yay!
Yeah. David gave us a good segue into where we focused as a group on for this particular Sunday, and that was David versus Goliath. And this is a story that everyone knows. I mean, well, maybe not everyone knows, but most people know. And basically, it's we've got a sense of in this particular text of as David already mentioned, and now I understand why you like this text so much, that basically you've got, the odds are unbelievable. You've got David, who is caught in only because nobody else is willing to go fight against this big Goliath. And Goliath, by the way, this is from Stephen Mackenzie, from the Oxford Bible, telling us a little bit about some of these parts, that Goliath is 6 cubits and a span. So it's 9.5 feet tall. The Septuagint has them shorter, but that's pretty tall. And if you add the bronze helmet on top, then you're going to get, like, that would be frightening even today, let alone in that particular time. The coat of mail that he wears is 5,000 shekels, which is equivalent to about 126 pounds. And then the spear on his javelin weighs more than 15 pounds. And the weaver's beam, it might be the slinging shot thing that Goliath would have had himself. So in other words, Goliath is pretty frightening. He's a pretty big guy. And the Philistines in general have amazing power, armor, javelins, chariots, horse, strong helmets, iron and bronze tools. So basically David, he's out in this field. He takes a break from sheep watching, is bringing provisions of food to his brothers. And when he enters the scene of 2 armies facing each other, ready to pounce, and no one's willing to fight Goliath, which, totally makes sense. And we know the story. He volunteers. He argues he's killed bears and sheep before, and he promises that God will protect him, because David recognizes he has power and worth, even if others scoff at him. Now, there's probably a lot of skeptics like Saul, but Saul's like, yeah, whatever, we'll take this guy. And Saul might have even thought of him as expendable, and others might have as well. Who cares if this young boy dies? Better him than an important leader. Saul insists that David fight with the rules from the power. And David, our David already talked about this a little bit, that basically he's told to wear the armor and all that is supposed to be worn when you go to battle. And David soon realized this strategy doesn't work for him because it's way too heavy and he can't move, it says. He strips off the armor, returns to what he knows, how to fight off predators with the tools he has. So he's got a sense of self-awareness, and he is unencumbered by the trappings of and rules of power and privilege. Takes a sling, and the rest is history. So I'm going to stop there, but let me just end it up by saying that David knows that the old structure doesn't work anymore. He needs a new structure. He needs to trust God and himself to fell the giant and save his community. So he has self-assurance.
I love this. And one of my narrative thoughts was, if any of you ever worked with psychodrama, and psychodrama is a great way to bring other people in, other voices in, like we talked about before. You can actually have people act this out. And I did this with my DMin students online. So it can be done online if you're online. But if you're in person, it's really great. And with this particular story, the characters aren't necessarily touching each other. So we can maintain safe distances and still act this out, right? You could actually have people volunteer and enact the different characters. And what you do is you stop it throughout the story. You read the story almost like a Lectio Divina thing, where you read the story, you pause at certain parts and you ask the character, how are you feeling? As David, how are you feeling? Or how are you feeling as Goliath? Or how are you feeling as the guys back on the hill that Goliath is protecting and he just fell? And now you're exposed and vulnerable. All right. So these kinds of words might come up. I'm vulnerable, or I'm feeling like I'm finally being heard for the first time, or et cetera, et cetera. These kinds of things may come up. And this can be then a place where you can riff off into a sermon and start talking about what that means for us today in light of COVID, in light of the trial that just came down, all the things that are happening, the shootings, whatever's happening. Unfortunately, as I tell my students these days, you're not going to have any excuse for not preaching about justice this semester, because you have got almost every single day something happening which you can speak out on. So how could this story illuminate what's happening right now? And how can the people themselves bring their own emotions into it through something like maybe psychodrama and asking those questions afterwards?
So this, as a couple people have mentioned in the chat, this is Father's Day. It's also, there's a couple other things happening. I also challenge you to bring up and mention. So oftentimes we don't understand, or we forget that when we worship together, when we invoke the Holy Spirit, we call in the Holy Spirit, immediately it transports us in this mystical, greater sanctuary space where you're worshiping with the whole world, right? You're worshiping with all communities. So even if your community has never heard the word Juneteenth, I want to encourage you to use it and talk about it, because it is a Goliath moment. It is. So that might weave its way into the sermon. Also, I thought that this scripture passage and the worship experience can invite men to look at what it means. This story is a story about one young man deciding to throw off toxic masculinity in order to confront Goliath. So the king offers him armor, makes him, here, look like all the guys. Whoa, here you are, right? And do all the things. And he says, this doesn't fit. What if we developed in our sermon preparation and in our worship preparation an opportunity to invite men to talk about what it means to confront the Goliaths of our day, poverty and racism and all the things that we mentioned before, and do it in a way that invites people, invites especially men to talk about, I want to do this as Jesus taught us, to throw off that masculinity that invites violence, and I've got to be tough, and I can't cry, and I can't this, what if this is an opportunity to say, all I have is my scars and what I know, and all I have is these smooth stones, life experiences, and this is what I have, and this is what I'm going to bring, right? As opposed to all the other stuff that society wants us to bring. Both men and women, both, and to our non-binary friends as well, in non-binary spaces. That's another way of creating non-binary spaces, is another way of moving away from that. It's not just toxic masculinity, but what does it mean to be a parent in this world? What does it mean to embrace that role? And is nurturing just for women? I don't believe so. I think men are pretty nurturing. So, how do we let's walk into using the music that's around us. There's a lot of music from Ruth Duck, has beautiful music around using those words. Ruth Duck, Shirley Murray also uses a lot of imagery around that. So just, I invite you to do that.
And I'm going to quickly jump in because I think that Lydia touched on so many themes that I want to make sure that they linger. But I would also just kind of build on music to talk about what's not out there, right? If we think about popular music, for example, think about those songs that are dedicated to mothers, there's plenty. How many songs in popular culture dedicated to fathers? Not many. And those that are there, Papa was a Rolling Stone, Temptations, really? Even Mother's Day, there's a great song by the Intruders that has a little part in it that talks about, where's Dad? Like, oh, Dad was hanging out. Dad was so I think that, again, it starts to enable us to challenge some of those mythologies about masculinity, and also recognize that we have to be careful about not marginalizing folks, because we know we have a lot of people in our communities and our congregations who have played both roles. So there's not as binary or discrete. And I think also when we think about this, particularly as a Father's Day message, that father can be also, we look at the patriarchal nature of the Bible. We look about the patriarchal nature of society that we've got, again, as we've kind of talked about throughout this morning, was talking about how can we turn some of those things on its head a little bit and still remain authentic, and also help us to kind of reimagine what this might look like going forward. I would also say that one thing that we talked about early was don't put all the weight on Sunday. Right, I get it. Look, I'm a father of two beautiful, wonderful girls, and my wife is like, look, if I can just get the big piece of chicken at the end of the day, that's Father's Day to me, so that's fine. So but we don't have to necessarily let it all roll up to Sunday. There's a lot of discussion that could happen. There could be Bible study on Wednesday. There could be there's a lot of materials that are out there that often challenge this, and because this is such a recognizable, as we talked before, biblical story, it does provide us with, at least you don't have to say, well, let me tell you the story. We know the story. How then can we build from the story, flip it from a different perspective, and find our own meaning in it, regardless of how we identify in terms of our gender identity? And also at the same time, kind of recognize that, we talked about, and I'm going to now hand this off, talk about the Goliath, right? Because there are, just as Lydia mentioned, there are Goliaths in our lives, giants of addiction. There's giants of distrust, giants of things that kind of keep us. And think about this too. I'm going to connect it back to this George Floyd moment. Even though you got a verdict, that's when the work begins. So even though the giant was vanquished, that then became, now how do we now live into this? It's not just a single blow. It's a single blow that became a catalyst for a lot of other things. So we need to start thinking about how are sometimes when we, and let's be real clear, this is a Hollywood moment. One throw, giants down. We typically have to throw a few rocks, okay, in order to knock the giants down. And then how do we then live in that? Because a lot of us are defined by the giants we've been trying to conquer. We've been defined by depression, defined by different things that kind of hold us back to what God wants to have us in our lives. So we're going to have to find ways to get past Father's Day, June 20th, and also recognize that we can work together to continue to keep our giants in a proper perspective so they can allow us to have the blessings that God intends for us to have.
Okay, moving on to the next week. We focused a lot on the Mark and Corinthians text, and the focus on, if you see a need, make your hope. Do it. Do something with it. For example, in Mark, we've got two narratives. One is named with two people. One is named and has status in the community, Jairus, and the other is not named and has used up all her resources. Jairus, you know the story. The daughter's gravely ill. The crowd surrounds Jesus, but he sees an opportunity. He throws himself at Jesus's feet, blocking him from moving, and begs for his daughter multiple times for Jesus to come lay hands on her and heal her. So he's persistent. And then he finally gets Jesus to move toward the house. But what I really love is in the middle of this narrative, you have this unnamed woman who interrupts not only the narrative, but as well as Jesus's journey to save the daughter. And she too has a need. She too believes in Jesus, and she too sees an opportunity. She's been hemorrhaging blood for about 12 years. And by the way, this is the same number of years old that Jairus' daughter has been alive. So you've got that connection there. And this woman is sick and tired of it. She's had multiple medical tests from multiple physicians. She's used up all her money. And Amy Jo Levine suggests that she must have had status and autonomy, and she still has status and autonomy because she acts, but for her to have money to spend, that would have been an issue. But now she's worse off than she said. And so she was. So she says, if I touch Jesus's clothes, I'll be made well. I want to say something here about this text, because so many people go straight into purity laws in ancient Israel and sometimes malign them, and they aren't necessarily taken as oppressive by those who've practiced them. So that's something to keep in mind. But Amy Jo Levine reminds us that focusing on the purity laws is misdirected, because Mark's account and the others really they're concerned about healing, not purity laws. And Lydia reminded us when we talked that Jesus gave this unnamed woman more than what she thought she was worthy of. Jesus looks for her. And some say, it's interesting, some people say that Jesus kind of says, who did that? Because he might be mad. But what if Jesus is more concerned about hearing her need and wants to take time out to listen to her needs? By the way, which is what he does. She's frightened, but she approaches Jesus, says she did it, and then tells him what her story is. And Jesus affirms her and tells her that her faith has saved her. So she perseveres, she takes agency, she takes power and into her own hands. Now, when we go back to Jairus, whose daughter by now is dead, there's a lot of weeping and wailing. And our group asked us to think about who's allowed to cry in the sad situation, that, and to remind people that God can handle our tears, our rage, and all of this. And basically, though, Jesus heals this young girl and the hemorrhaging woman, and they don't wait for an invitation. They take authority. We do want to say a couple things really quickly that Corinthians, our group kind of took issue with the statement that God doesn't give us more than we can handle, because some communities or individuals get hit harder than others. So how we hear this is contextual. And also Paul states in 8:15, as it's written, the one who had much did not have too much, and the one who had little did not have too little. And again, our social location might determine how we hear it. The privileged might hear, hey, you have enough, so give. But if you really don't have enough, you should probably hear this as, I don't have enough to give. So bottom line is, in these texts, we saw them as focusing on if there's a need, make it happen. Don't sit and wait. Take authority and go for it. I'm going to hand it over.
No, that's great. Just briefly, some homiletical thoughts. Again, I'm bringing in narrative. And again, but with these narratives in particular, I want us to just think about the ethics behind it and being very careful about the pitfalls for stereotypes and misreadings, which you did hear from Deborah. And so you can easily give caveats in your sermons. You can say, well, you've heard it said this, and I'm going to tell you about that. All right. And you could talk about the purity laws if you want. All right. And things like that. You could use a Lowry plotline in order to use those stereotypes and pitfalls as a flip, as an aha moment for people. For instance, it's written, the one who had much did not have too much. The one who had little did not have too little. And an important caveat might be that you explain, this is not an example how we do not need to give because God will take care of people. It could be rather, or you could use it as a flip. So the caveat might be when you start out, this is not what this is about here. Now I'm going to talk about what I believe it's about. Or you could use it as a flip and you could say, yeah, God will provide, but have we considered that it may very well be that the ones that God is using, us, we're the ones that God's going to use to make sure that they're provided for. So again, it can become a flip for us. And when it moves into like the Mark passage, especially, okay, so here's some of the ways in which those passages could easily be given into stereotypes. So I'm wondering if this might be a time to get those roundtables going and get the women in your congregation talking to you before you get into the pulpit, or, and if you can do this if you're online or in person, getting the children to speak. What would it mean to have the kids? What would it mean to take a children's time and turn it into the main sermon and allow the children to speak? We're in COVID. I'm not necessarily saying that you want to talk about death and dying with the kids, okay? But illness and sickness, you could certainly talk about if it's a need in your congregation and it's something that people haven't thought about or you think that they could use some help with. Allowing the kids to speak and to preach could be very powerful.
Thanks, Suzanne. I also think that this is an opportunity to remember that we are possibly for some of us stepping back into our in-person worship experiences, and that just like grief goes through stages, for some people coming back into the worship space is a new moment of grieving. Okay, this is a new moment of for a lot of our families, well, across the country, right? Over 600,000 people are missing family members, and coming back into a worship space could be such a reminder of that family member who came to church with me, who was baptized here, or who was, so remember that as you step back into your worship space, and in connection with this scripture passage, that there are a lot of people that are longing for touch, because we've been so isolated and separated from each other, right? We're so longing for that human ability to heal each other through our shared tears, and through and beyond our Zoom experiences or our virtual experiences, coming back into that space. So recognizing, you know, I pray, I hope and pray that the wind of Pentecost has moved us in such a way that we will never come back into our worship spaces the same. That we refuse to pretend that everything's okay. It's not. It's not. And one of the things that really irks me about the lectionary team for these passages is that it leaves the rest of Lamentations out and only focuses on this part of Lamentations. Well, the whole book is a community that's tussling. It's a community that's wrestling with, okay, now what? Now we're coming back to this space, and what am I supposed to do with all these feelings? Just remember that and you're going to tell me about the steadfast love of the Lord is, okay. Meanwhile, I've got all this stuff. And so Jairus's healing and this woman's healing is about the ability to have somebody notice them and have somebody see their pain. And so maybe it's about, creating rituals as you come into the worship space, as you gradually get back into full swing in your worship. And for some of you, you already have. But what is it? Is it an opportunity to bless the space again? Is it an opportunity to do a post-COVID blessing on your space that calls us into, and from now on, we're going to be a healing community. We're going to be a community that invites the tears. We're going to be a community that, all those things that you can do just based on this scripture passage in worship.
And I'm going to very quickly, because I'm looking at our time, and I know Suzanne's going to help us kind of make sure that we get to our last piece. But there's two things I want to mention about this particular passage. And I love what Lydia is saying about, blessing our space when we go in, because a lot of us, and there's a lot of research that's out there, friends, about the importance of place, particularly in terms of finding whatever normalcy might be, but also there's a lot even more information about not going back to what you did before, meaning not just physically going to the same place, but how you receive people, how things look there. There should be some transformation, because this pandemic has forced our churches out of our buildings, appropriately so, and we needed to be out of our buildings, but also we need to kind of recognize that there's a certain sense of safety, a certain sense of warmth, comfort, and whatever you might want to call it. Great way to kind of plug this this particular passage in is looking at two things that start with D. One is differently able, right? Accessibility issues. The fact that this woman had to do whatever she did to touch the hem of that garment. We want to look at accessibility issues in our churches in terms of how we value how folks connect in. So being able to do that is very, very important so as we start to think about particularly diverse spaces and things of that nature. So differently able folks and how they're able to do that. The second D, though, is determination. There is nothing that's kind of like the theme of that particular passage in Mark that said, we'll stop this person. And I love what Deborah's mentioned before when he said, well, who touched me? Because sometimes we interpret that as almost being elitist, as opposed to, no, well, that was an opportunity to minister. That was an opportunity to connect. And a lot of times we're not always as proactive as we need to be to find out, or even, let's be honest, let's not put the spotlight on someone who has a visible thing that might be disabling or differently able, because that is not also something that can be healing either. We have to work with the compassion that we have and the smartness, of course, to be able to find how we can access people who are trying to access us.
Okay, I'm going to spend very short seconds because there's so many things that I heard out of Lydia and Suzanne and David for this. This is 4th of July.
And I was going to say too, Deborah, real quick, since we're coming up to the top of the hour and some of you had planned your time to be done at noon, if you have to leave, that's fine. I'll be recording and putting the recording up of the main session. We had agreed as a group that we were going to stay a little bit longer if it went for Q&A after. So we're going to finish up this last week. If you have to go, we understand. It's, you need to go. If you want to stay, feel free. And if you have other questions, then some of us will be able to stay for questions after. Okay. And this is what we're concentrating on. And I will let you speak, Deborah. Thank you so much, Deborah.
Welcome. Okay. This again is 4th of July week. And that basically the focus is on speaking truth to ourselves and to our communities, speaking truth to power, and recognizing that it takes hard work and a willingness to risk much to convey God's truth. So we've got Paul in 2 Corinthians talking about the thorn in his flesh, and that he asked God 3 times to take it away. And basically he sees this in a beloved community like Paul, we face our hurt, our weaknesses. God forgives us, but it's always going to be part of who we are. And we need to work through our weaknesses and be willing to grow as individuals and community. But Paul also says he's going to speak the truth no matter what. And when we look at Mark's gospel, this is a text where he goes home and he's rejected. And he also moves on and commissions and sends his disciples out to ministry. And so in many ways, the disciples are called to speak truth to power. And this message isn't always going to be welcome. In fact, being a prophet is dangerous, which is why Jesus builds in a support system with his disciples to send them out. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over because there were some really great ideas from other people on this text.
I'll just really quickly, again, talk about, obviously, we're talking about ethical questions again, right? So what questions do you have yourself? What do you bring to the text from your own experience? You've really looked at yourself now. You're starting to really delve into your own social location. What view do you bring to this text when it comes to the secular holiday that we're talking about? And then look at your context. How many of us have Boy Scouts or veterans or others that expect to have this be a big celebration about national pride in the United States? Are we prepared to talk about July 4th through a lens of Pentecost that includes turning the world upside down and a beloved community that's trying to dismantle this unholy Trinity we talked about, which includes war? I would suggest that we have spent the past weeks preaching on some difficult texts. And if we decide to preach a prophetic sermon on July 4th, that we need each other. Wesley said, we can't do this alone. We can't preach alone. And so we're going to encourage you to do as we have. We've had this group of 4 here that have been meeting, forming groups, praying for each other on this Sunday. If you decide to preach a prophetic sermon on July 4th, it is going to be very difficult, whatever instance you're in, praying for each other that day, checking in with each other afterwards. If you're interested in being a part of a prayer group like that, reach out to me. You have my email. Many thoughts about this in particular, I would say, for this sermon. This came up, I think David brought up, Lydia brought it up. What if we let someone else talk for us? And so what if we have Frederick Douglass's July 4th Independence Day speech come up and we bring excerpts from that? It's pretty long, so you could do excerpts of it. If you have the kind of group that would read it beforehand, and then you come together and you have a discussion sermon. I mean, Dr. King's speech from 1968 on war, you could play it. It's recorded. I can give you the link to that. You can play excerpts from that. You could talk about it. I had the great honor and privilege of spending time with the writer of that speech, Dr. Vincent Harding, who said he always felt guilty about that speech because he believes it's what got Dr. King killed. So that's how dangerous this is, people. So we really need to be praying for each other if we're going to do this. And I'm thinking questions that you might want to ponder. What is freedom for us? Some of us are going to be, as Lydia said, we're coming into the sanctuary for the first time. We're visiting family for the first time. Others may still be unable to be free because vaccines, the inequity of vaccines, issues about work and being out of work. What kind of freedom is that when you don't have a paycheck? And if it's a nationalistic, militaristic venture for this, what kind of reflexive work do we have to go on for ourselves to really think about how that meshes with the gospel for us, right? I will offer Memorial Day is traditionally a day to honor our military service persons and families. So that really leaves July 4th open. But July 4th can also be turned into a celebration of democracy. So do we consider the fact that we are truly a republic And as such, we do not all have representation, and not everyone has a voice. So again, difficult issues to talk about, but are we thinking about it in those, and are people thinking about it? Are we having these discussions? When we speak the hard word, it's not only important that we have people around us, but how is our demeanor? So how can we have a pastoral tone, paying attention that it's not a lot of finger wagging, but perhaps just a discussion and a conversation. In the end, this is a very hard word, and speaking the truth, I think, truly is a dangerous act. So let us be in prayer for each other.
I just want to say real quick, I put some possibilities for that day. This Is My Song is a great hymn that has implications for us to see ourselves beyond just the exceptionalism of one country, right? That's one hymn that you can use. There is a group called The Brilliance that has great hymns or music that you can use a lot of times in contemporary settings, but you could also use it in emerging settings where you have both a blended of contemporary and traditional. They have a lot of music. They have a whole album centered around the immigration experience. And you could talk about that in the midst of 4th of July. And there's also, of course, a lot of spirituals that talk about freedom, because freedom is a part of that movement. But if you nuance it with the words of Frederick Douglass, if you build a litany around a call to worship with using the words of Frederick Douglass and a spiritual, that would be one way to invite people into some conversation. And also there are alternative texts to America the Beautiful. There really are, where they invite us to think about justice and peace and equity. So those are just a few things.
The last thing I'll,
I'm
I'm sorry,
sorry.
go
The
ahead,
last
lady.
thing I want to say is the Pentecost people deserve Pentecost preachers.
Wow, that was a line worth waiting for. Thank you, Lydia, for that. And the last thing that I will say is, because I know we're already at 12:01, we want to allow time for questions and answers and some dialogue, is that recognize that Independence Day in particular, since rarely does it fall on a Sunday, but here we are, it'll fall on Sunday, July 4th. And what we've been saying before about the notion of becoming beloved community is an ongoing dynamic. It's not just a stopping point. So the same way, Independence Day and the freedoms that we enjoy is a very real, living, breathing dynamic. There's fits and starts. There's things to push that pull, And I think also, if you would choose to, because the passage in Mark that is on the lectionary talks about what happens when Jesus gets a chance to rest. It's not a chance to rest to get out the game. It's a chance to rest to redouble his efforts. When he says, it tells the waves, peace, be still. It's because even in the work that we all try to do, and I agree with Suzanne, that this is tough stuff and not to be taken lightly. And it does require other folks to be able to help us to get to where we need to get to. But otherwise, we have to think about this as an ongoing dynamic, not just a place that stops and starts. It's something that continues to live. And I think some of the texts that we've mentioned can help us to find ways to